Welcome back. We come to the end finally of Athenian history as we need to understand it for the purpose of ancient Greek, especially Athenian comedy. Subsequent videos will turn now over to Roman history, and we'll now bring a relatively rapid conclusion to Greek history that's independent of Macedonia. So, as we wrapped up in the previous video, the Athenians plus all the other Greeks were essentially descending into a state of chaos. And in fact, the historian Xenophon, who wrote about the history after the period covered by Thucydides, concluded his history with the Battle of Mantinea in 362 BC. Just to be clear, that's a different battle from the earlier Battle of Mantinea in 418 BC. There were, in fact, two of them. So the Battle of Mantinea, 362 BC, was a major conflict between Sparta and Athens on one side and Thebes on the other, where the Thebans were making an invasion of Sparta and Spartan territory. This was something that had been building up for about a decade, and eventually it ended in a huge draw, whereby neither the Spartans nor the Thebans ended up in complete control. When this happened, Xenophon concluded his history by saying there was even more confusion after this battle than there had been previously. And then he just ends his history right there. So other historians from a much later period, such as Polybius from Macedonia, and Diodorus from the island of Sicily, and Dionysius from a city called Halicarnassus, plus some others, supply us with the information we need to keep the history going. And although their histories all have imperfections with them, we're able to reconstruct pretty well what happened in subsequent years. Now, if there is one figure for you to remember in this course on ancient Greek comedy, whose influence actually is profound on the evolution of comedy, it's this man, Philip. You'll notice I'm pointing to him and not to his much more famous son, Alexander. Alexander, of course, was enormously instrumental in totally toppling the previous world and replacing it with an entirely different world. But why am I putting so much emphasis on Philip? You wouldn't have had Alexander without Philip, and you wouldn't have had Greek New Comedy without Philip. So that's why, and Philip is a neat guy. So that's why it's important to be well aware of what goes on with Philip of Macedon. So again, this is not the place to give a full description of him, but I will just give you the basic highlights to get a sense of what went on with him. So Philip of Macedon himself had a rather difficult time getting himself established in Macedonia as king. If you check on your map, you'll see that in the yellow land to the left of the map, you have Greece itself with the Peloponnesus in the southwest corner. Then you have mainland Greece, which includes Thessaly, which is north of that, and that's northwest of Athens. And then keep on going up north, and the area where the Aegean Sea sort of ends, and if you're continuing further north, you're going to go into the Balkan territories, where all the various countries are today, where Yugoslavia used to exist. That includes a location called Illyria. That's a group of people who caused a lot of trouble over the years for both the Macedonians and later the Romans. And be aware, by the way, that the Adriatic Sea is right there, and across the Adriatic Sea to the west is Italy. But in between all that is the area called Macedonia. To be clear, that area that's previously Macedonia is not the same as the country of the Republic of Macedonia that exists there today. Those are two different areas of land, even though they do occupy around the same general territory. So the Macedonians had never been considered real Greeks by the rest of the Greeks, but frequently they did ally with other Greeks from time to time. And you may be aware that the tragic playwright Euripides withdrew to Macedonia and wrote plays as the king's playwright for the king Archelaus up there. Okay, so Philip had to fight off several pretenders to the throne and also fought a series of wars in Illyria before he eventually was able to establish himself as king. So it took him some years to get going. He also had a disability. He was shot in the eye during battle and was actually blind for much of his life in one eye. This did not stop him, however, and it's all the more impressive that he kept on going. He also suffered several other major war wounds in his life, and the fact that he kept on going through all that is quite remarkable. Philip recognized the chaos evolving to his south and realized that an opportunity lay there. If he could figure out how to play one city off against the other, he would be enormously successful and could eventually score a big scoop up of all of Greece. It worked brilliantly. I did not put it on the board here, but one of the major conflicts that came up in central Greece was called the Sacred War. There were several of them, but this Sacred War is the most important one historically. This involved the place called Delphi, which you can find on your map. Delphi, of course, is famous for the oracle that gives divine pronouncements in response to people's questions about what might happen in the future or what will occur if they take a certain course of action. So the Delphic oracle was overseen by 12 cities that formed what in Greek is called an Amphictyony, which is the word for an alliance of cities that surround a particular area and which are responsible for overseeing it. Of the 12 cities, 11 got along fine, but the 12th didn't. The 12th was the Phocians, who tried on different occasions to take command of Delphi away from the other Greeks. And in fact, the Phocians committed a violation in the 340s BC that led to this war. Now, as the war unfolded, the other members of the Amphictyony looked around for allies, and Philip stepped in at that moment and said that if he would help defeat the Phocians, if he could be placed on the Amphictyonic Council, which they granted. As a consequence, once he was on the council, he was able to have a very high amount of influence on the ongoings of the Delphic oracle, and he was able thereby to ingratiate himself in with many of these other central Greek cities, so that gradually he weakened their resolve and also lowered their sense of defensiveness as to any possible plans Philip might have had for the future. So that was one of his first steps. The other thing that Philip did very effectively that really caught the Athenians, especially napping, was that Philip realized that the way to weaken Athens especially was to take cities away from it that supplied vital equipment to the Athenians, like ships, and also just to create crises of morale for the Athenians. So Philip probably knew his history and was aware of how much trouble the Athenians had had about Amphipolis. So the Athenians, of course, had been trying for quite a long time to get Amphipolis back in their possession. Philip finally moved on Amphipolis in mid 4th century BC and was able to capture it. That warned the Athenians of what kind of actions were to be taken. And the Athenian orator Demosthenes was the one who delivered several speeches to the Athenians trying to warn them of what was going on to Philip. There were, in fact, 4 altogether. Eventually, Philip not only was able to get Amphipolis, but even moved down a little bit south of Amphipolis down to the Chalcidice Peninsula and was able to hit upon the city of Olynthus. Philip was eventually able to take over Olynthus away from the Athenians and destroyed it. And that was the end of Olynthus. And that was despite repeated calls from Demosthenes and others to go and assist. The Athenians refused to assist the Olynthians. This is actually a spooky echo of previously when the Athenians refused to help the Plataeans when the Thebans moved in on Plataea during the Peloponnesian War, wanting to destroy it because of past wrongs. And the Athenians refused to help Plataea, even though the Plataeans had helped them in the Battle of Marathon. So now here we have Olynthus that the Athenians neglect to their cost, and they lose Olynthus. So the Athenians finally do get into a war with Philip, but Philip actually defeats them, and finally peace is made in 346 BC. And one of the effects of the peace is that the Athenians finally are forced to renounce all claims of any type on Amphipolis. And that finally ends the history of Amphipolis, the really ignominious loss of Amphipolis by the Athenians since that fatal day in 424 BC when Brasidas got Amphipolis away from them. All right, it didn't take long after that. Once Philip had those footholds in place, he just kept on mobilizing his forces, and eventually he challenged the Greeks at Chaironeia, which is not far away from Thebes, in 338 BC. Finally, the Greek cities that were left were able to band together and attempt to stop Philip from marching any further. But it was of no use. By that time, Philip had superior technology and weapons and organization, and he was able to come through and just wipe right through them one after the other. And Chaeronea finally, which by the way was the home of the later biographer Plutarch, finally fell under Philip's control, 338 BC, and within days after, Philip was able to get complete control of all of Greece thereafter. So essentially, Athenian history ends here, although this is not quite the end of the story. There's a little bit more coming up to it. The problem was that just at the point when Philip got hold of all this power, he had a family issue involving his wife Olympias, who was the mother of Alexander. And in 336 BC, at a public festival, Philip was assassinated. Now, the moment that Philip disappeared from the scene, the Greeks down south thought they had an opportunity, and they banded together again and revolted. They probably thought the young sprout Alexander was someone that they could easily deal with. They were mistaken. Not only did Alexander come down quite forcefully to vanquish the Greeks to his south, but in order to make his point definite, he razed to the ground the city of Thebes, except famously he preserved the house of Pindar, one of the original 9 canonical lyric poets. Alexander went from there, of course, to go on to conquer Egypt, and then most of the portions of the Persian Empire that lay all the way out to India over the next decade and a couple more years. Alexander died unexpectedly of an illness in 323 BC, so we consider the classical age to end at that point, because by the time Alexander was finished completely transforming the Greek world, there was very little of the polis system left over. And in fact, the Greek civilization now started to ride on what were called leagues, like the Aetolian League to the north, and then the Achaean League, including Corinth further to the south. These leagues now essentially overlay and really superseded the whole polis system that had existed from the 7th, 6th, and 5th centuries BC on. Well, so Alexander himself, of course, took over Greece, but pretty much left it in his shadow as he went off to deal with Persia. And of course, he died unexpectedly quite young out there without having left an ally. As soon as he was dead, one more time, the Greeks banded again, trying to revolt, and especially Athens this time was the one instrumental in leading the revolt in what was called the Lamian War, 323 to 322 BC. However, once again, the Macedonians were able to move down and defeat the Athenians at the Battle of Crannon, Crannon. 322 BC finally sees the termination of Athenian democracy. It's at that point that we see the regency established of Demetrius of Phaleron in Athens. It is in this period that we now see the flourishing of Greek New Comedy, which, as we talked about in a prior video, was much more staid in its approach to its plots and the humor that it uses than prior examples of comedy, since we no longer have the democracy that is going to permit the kind of open expression that old comedy had. So it turns out that the regency representing Macedonia was quite fortunate for our playwright Menander, as we talked about in the video related to him, because Menander got along quite well with the region and got sponsorships. And Menander also knew how to adapt for his times, and the kind of comedy that he wrote, the Greek New Comedy, was just right for the day. So Discalus, the grouch, the story about this older man who pushes everybody away and won't marry his daughter, is a nice family comedy. Very, very generic and low-key that won't cause any disturbances with anybody. So as you read in that play, the whole issue turns over whether or not this wealthy aristocratic man, Sostratus, is going to be able to marry the daughter of this countryman, Cnemon. And by rights, he should have an opportunity to do so, but Cnemon won't let him even nearby. So the son, Gorgias, the estranged son of the father Cnemon, arranges for Sostratus to work out in the fields in order to show that he's capable of doing farm work and therefore is an appropriate husband for Cnemon's daughter. As it turns out, luck goes Sostratus' way because Cnemon has an accident, as you will either remember or will see soon. He falls into the well out the back, and Gorgias and Sostratus work together to rescue Cnemon, whereupon he somewhat modifies his ways and agrees to allow his son Gorgias to find an appropriate husband for his daughter. He finally realizes, yes, he should have been taking care of that, and therefore it's quite easily arranged for Gorgias to give his sister to this man, Sostratus. And in the end, when the big wedding party happens, there's a festival in honor of Pan. Finally, the slaves manage to get Cnemon, the old man, out of bed, drag him over there, and finally get him into the party. And finally, he's up there with his wreath and dancing with everybody else. And that's how the play ends. So you don't have any kind of the political directness that you have with previous comedy. Now everything is nice and gentle, very straightforward. It's funny, it's humorous, but it doesn't have that bite that we used to see in prior comedy. With that, we conclude Greek history, and now our remaining videos on the history series will cover Roman history and Roman literature. We'll see you next video.